A day in the life of a US slave. Have you ever pondered on the horrors of slavery when people were property? The variation of horrendous treatments against these trapped souls over time is merely a fraction of slavery's terrifying composition. The implications, however, on culture, society, history, and economy go far beyond what we all learned at school. Hello, friends. Well, if you often fantasize about the past and really want to know about the history of ancient civilizations, then you're at the right place. Welcome to Unthinkable Past, a channel better known for dishing up the outlandish ancient traditions of all times. Today, we'll be looking at the trials and tribulations in the daily life of slaves in the United States. So better buckle up and let's binge history together. It's almost impossible for us today to imagine how difficult life was for slaves in the antebellum period of US history. The institution of slavery was not only morally reprehensible, but also economically driven, with those in power exploiting the enslaved individuals for their own gain. As work was long and arduous, food and shelter was scarce, a threat of brutal punishment loomed, and families could be split up at the whim of an enslaver. Yet, heroically, they not only survived, but also created families, culture, art, and maintained religious practices. But how? Let's dig a bit deeper. Starting with some of the historical background. African slaves were being used by the Spanish, French, and Portuguese in what later became the United States in the 16th century. Slaves accompanied Ponce de Leon to Florida in 1513, for instance, but a far greater proportion of slaves arrived in chains in crowded, sweltering cargo holds. People were, in fact, abducted from the African continent, forced into slavery in the American colonies, and exploited to work in the production of crops such as tobacco and cotton throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Slavery, in fact, became a thriving institution by the 1800s, particularly in the southern United States. But why? Oh, wait a second. The invention and rapid proliferation of the cotton gin proved to be one of the key reasons for the revival of slavery. This machine enabled southern planters to grow a variety of cotton known as the short staple cotton that was especially well suited to the climate of the Deep South. But the bottleneck in cultivating this crop has always been the labor required to remove the seeds from the cotton fibers. Eli Whitney's gin had now made it much easier and more economical to do, and cotton production became considerably more profitable as a result, making it more appealing to southern planters and farmers. Still, cotton farming was much more labor-intensive, and cotton growers needed a significant supply of manpower to tend the fields. African slaves again solved this problem. Well, slavery did much more than just provide a source of cheap labor. It actually went beyond that and established a network of systemic exploitation that eventually served as the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. However, getting to the life of the slaves on these plantations, say their accommodation, diet, and treatment. To a degree, the material conditions of slave life were predetermined by the status of the slave. Even then, they belonged to the lowest, poorest ranks of society. The slaves, in fact, were condemned to impoverishment by the law, as they could not participate in any wage-earning trade or labor. They were also denied the right to own property. The slave's subsequent reliance on his or her owner for the most basic necessities, food, clothing, and shelter, was, however, critical to the master's power and the survival of the slave society. Well, the majority worked and lived on the plantations in small shacks with dirt floors and thatched roofs, having little or even no furnishings. Literally far from something like the log slave cabins often depicted in books and films. Most of these plantations had 50 or fewer slaves. However, the larger plantations had hundreds. Toiling in shifts of up to 18 hours a day during harvest season, the life of slaves on the fields was all about working from sunup to sundown 6 days a week and having food, a basic need that was even sometimes unfit for an animal to consume. Even children and the elderly were not spared from working long hours. Slaves were usually given a day off on Sundays and on rare occasions like Christmas or the 4th of July. Moving on. The diet mostly offered to the slaves was, in fact, barely adequate to meet the demands of their heavy workload. Their usual diet included maize, rice, peanuts, yams, and dry beans. They also get to eat pork once in a while. Plus, slaves, including their children, were absolutely forbidden from consuming any dairy products, despite the belief that people of African descent are especially lactose intolerant. Again, the enslavers supplied only the minimum needed for survival. They were primarily concerned with keeping their slaves alive and working, rather than providing for their comfort, health, or safety. Plus, life on vast plantations with a brutal overseer was the most dreadful. And working for a small farm owner who was not doing so well, on the other hand, may mean going hungry at times. Coming to their daily chores and obligations. Aside from daily planting and harvesting from dawn till dusk, Plantations and farms also required a variety of other kinds of jobs. Slaves had to clear fresh land, dig ditches, cut and move wood, slay livestock, and repair buildings and tools. They were frequently employed as mechanics, blacksmiths, drivers, carpenters, and other specialized skills. Black women had the extra burden of their families, like cooking and caring for the children, as well as spinning, weaving, and sewing to clothe their families, as they were not often provided with adequate clothing by the owners. Let's see how harassment, threats, and discrimination were as an integral part of slave life. Slavery took many forms, but the core concepts remained similar. Slaves, being black, were treated as property, and their property status was always reinforced by actual or threatened violence alongside this black and white discrimination. There were no safeguards in place to protect women from being sexually stalked, harassed, or raped by their masters and overseers, or from being used as long-term concubines. The abuse was common, as men in positions of authority took advantage of their situation. Even if a lady pretended to be fine with the circumstances, she did not have a choice. Slave men, on the other hand, were usually unable to protect the women that they adored. Enslavers or overseers often left sexually exploited women pregnant. Even the abuse used to continue, with enslavers' demands that they procreate to assure a future generation of forced, bound labor on plantations. And how could we forget the daily dose of punishments and mistreatment here? White masters had absolute control of a slave's life, and they often treated them as property. Plantation owners were allowed to act as dictators, since slaves had no rights at all. Those who disobeyed or objected, even in minor ways, were brutally punished or auctioned. And to tell you the truth, killing a slave was not even considered a felony. In addition, there was little interest in prosecuting for the mistreatment of these slaves, as it was common practice. Whipping, shackling, hanging, beating, burning, mutilation, branding, rape, and incarceration were all used to punish slaves, but the severity of the penalties meted out to the slaves varied. Even pregnant women were not spared. They were frequently whipped for any transgressions or misbehavior, and the number of lashes they received varied according to the gravity of their crime. Apprehended runaways, on the other hand, may be hung or maimed, and long-term chaining was often meted out to repeat runaway slaves. Suspended by their necks, they would stand with their limbs chained in a way that stretched and tore them. Moreover, a slave would be fitted with a metal collar. Such collars were thick and heavy, with projecting spikes that hampered both work and repose. Well, you will be shocked to know that sometimes the disobedient slaves were also boiled in sugar syrup to death, the height of cruelty. Furthermore, slaves were punished almost as much for symbolic social order transgressions as they were for physical failures. Amid this cruelty, however, their religious beliefs seemed as light as a breeze. Well, for internal peace and inspiration, slaves often purposefully tried to stick to their religious beliefs. Some followed African religions, such as Islam, while others adhered to a form of Christianity that was greatly inspired by African roots. Though slavery was harsh and often cruel life, their religious beliefs helped them bear the humiliation of bondage by reminding them that their lives had some sort of significance and dignity. However, by the mid-19th century, America's westward expansion, along with the growing anti-slavery movement in the North, provoked a national debate over slavery that helped precipitate the American Civil War in 1861-65. Though the Union victory freed the nation's 4 million slaves, the legacy of slavery influenced American history, from the chaotic years of Reconstruction from 1865 to 77 to the civil rights movement that emerged in the 1950s. Well, there you have it. We hope you liked this video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel without a delay. Make sure you turn on post notifications, and also let us know in the comment section about your views on the brutality in the daily lives of US slaves. Thanks for watching Unthinkable Past. Until the next time we meet, continue learning and stay healthy. Goodbye.